Evolution, natural selection, survival of the fittest. Each of these terms describes processes that are vital to the existence of complex life on this planet. This process, this force of nature, has over the last few hundred years come to be an accepted part of the natural world, in both the academic and public domains. Outside of a few die-hard creationists, whose popularity is worryingly increasing in some places, there are very few who would deny its importance to the existence of biological life. Despite the pervasiveness of the tried and tested theory of evolution, or maybe because of it, I find it eternally frustrating how frequently it seems to be misunderstood and misrepresented. Often strange claims will be made about how natural selection works and how this relates to human beings that seem to me to entirely misunderstand or misrepresent this natural process. One particular trait or group may be claimed to be the next stage in evolution. Another trait or group will be deemed a genetic dead end. People may claim that we are on an upward trajectory to some kind of Nietzschean Superman, or that social welfare will doom us to becoming a less evolved species by encouraging those less fit to breed. This last view is one I find particularly abhorrent and is traditionally considered part of social Darwinist thought, which seeks to apply the theory of natural selection to human society, usually by arguing that society was a struggle for existence in which the powerful are seen as more fit and evolved than marginalised or impoverished groups. This much discredited theory was once very popular in the late 19th and early 20th century, in large part thanks to proponents such as Herbert Spencer, who spent a good few years as the most popularly read philosopher in the United States. I wonder why. His social Darwinist theories seem to arrive at a time and a place in which they would be most fertile, in an ever-changing world in the grips of an industrial revolution, laissez-faire capitalism, and ever-increasing profits for those able to take advantage of the new technologies. I suspect Spencer's popularity in the US is one of the many reasons why some parts of it took the not-so-distant step from social Darwinism to eugenics, another abhorrent theory based upon the active selection of desirable traits, usually via forced sterilization of various marginal groups. A theory that is not only morally wrong, but factually and empirically misinformed. Though to be clear, Spencer himself was not a eugenicist. We have Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, to blame for the introduction of that nasty piece of pseudoscience. It is also worth noting that prior to the 1930s, give or take a few years, eugenics was taken up by a variety of people on all sides of the political spectrum. Nowadays, it is mostly associated with the far right, thanks to the Nazi Party's love of it. It's safe to say that I despise social Darwinism, eugenics, and scientific racism, which is often interrelated with the other two. In my mind, these theories came about partially from the misapplication of biological concepts, so it saddens me greatly to hear aspects of these misinformed views slip into public discourse about evolution. Hell, I've done it as a younger, shittier version of myself, by semi-jokingly referring to one of my closest friends as being less evolved since they are lactose intolerant, which has all sorts of problematic, and let's be frank, racist implications if you follow the line of logic. The application of biological concepts to human society is a tricky thing that needs to be approached with nuance, care, and awareness of our own ingrained prejudices. In the present day, with the advent of the age of the internet, it seems to me, though I could be wrong, that these biological concepts are often misapplied. So, I thought I would make this video and do my best to provide a relatively simplified depiction and clarification of how natural selection works, and talk a little bit about evolution in general. Like all mortal flesh sacks, I will be subject to error, so please let me know down in the comments below if you think I'm wrong about anything, or you would like some clarification on a particular aspect of the topic. It's time for me to finally put my biology degrees to work. Hello and welcome to Dunning-Kruger Philosophy, home of an overly opinionated wannabe philosopher badly interpreting whatever they've been reading recently. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed recently, and apology for the delays on putting out the new video, and any strange noises you hear in the background of this one. My puppy has currently eaten a shoe. Shit. As I was saying, my new puppy has been keeping me very busy. Recently, for my birthday, I was gifted the 2002 edition of Mary Midgley's Evolution as a Religion. whose work I will be heavily drawing upon throughout this video essay. In this provocatively titled book, she presents her ideas on how, in some circles, science has come to be used as a substitute for religion, thanks in part due to misunderstandings of the process of natural selection, and part due to the incorporation of pseudo-religious beliefs. Despite occasionally disagreeing with some of her takes, I found this book to be a fascinating synthesis of my interests in both biology and philosophy, making it difficult for me to put down, and inspiring me to make this video. The late Mary Midgley, who was once referred to in a Guardian biopic as the foremost scourge of scientific pretensions in this country, does an admirable job of exposing some of what she sees as pseudo-scientific and pseudo-religious views that have seeped into evolutionary biology. Her ire is especially aimed at what was known in the 1970s and 80s as sociobiology, founded by Edward O. Wilson, a field that examines social behaviour in the terms of evolution. In the modern day, you could see the popular science book form of evolutionary psychology as a successor to the sociobiology debate, whose proponents include living herald of the status quo, Steven Pinker. Look at this graph, everything's fine. Look at this graph! Now keep calm and carry on with things the way they are going. If you're interested in learning more about Pinker's problematic use of graphs, I suggest checking out Unlearning Economics video on the subject. Though, I will save my issues with sociobiology and evolutionary psychology for a different video, maybe. To be honest, might be a little bit out of my wheelhouse, so we'll see. I'm still waiting on reading a copy of Adapting Minds, Evolutionary Psychology and the Persistent Quest for Human Nature, by philosopher of science David Buller, during which he seeks to critique aspects of evolutionary psychology without dismissing or discarding the entire field, which seems reasonable to me. Don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. For now, all you need to know is that both the critics and proponents of sociobiology, and in some cases evolutionary psychology, take issue with the ideological nature of each other's stances. At first, when writing this, I thought it could be interesting to talk a little bit about natural selection, using the knowledge I gained from my background in biological sciences and microbiology in particular. I used to joke to my friends that working in a microbiology lab was like seeing evolution occurring in real time. Though, for today, I shall not be boring you all with overly technical language about bacteria. I'll save that for a different day. Instead, I think it would be a good idea to bore you all with a little context, history, and maybe a few definitions to discuss why I view that evolution is treated as overly competitive and is sometimes seen as a ladder or stepping stone to some necessarily great future. It should, however, be stated that before continuing further, that whilst I strive towards objectivity, I shall never reach it. This piece of work, like all things made with human hands, shall be subject to bias and error. To me, a veil of ignorance is an impossibility. The best I can do is try to present these biases plainly for you all to see and critically engage with, if that is your desire. So context, as I'm sure many of you are aware, in 1859, Charles Darwin introduced the world to his thesis on how evolution, via the process of natural selection, is responsible for the development of distinct populations, speciation, and the existence of biological life as we know it. Suddenly, an explanation for the diversity and complexity of life was available that was not predetermined by some grand designer. Though in all fairness, there are a few ideas like that already out there. As I'm sure most of you are already aware, Darwin's theories have had major implications on our place in the world. No longer were we seen as a species necessarily unique and separate from nature, but something that was part of and arose from it. Now, as I mentioned, this was not the first or only theory of evolution of the time period. One of the more fleshed out earlier evolutionary theories were those of French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's ideas on the inheritance of acquired characteristics, also known as Lamarckian inheritance, or soft inheritance. He theorized that the main driving force behind evolution was a form of soft inheritance in which traits acquired during life will be passed down to their offspring. A classic example from his Philosophie Zoologique is that a blacksmith gets strong muscles from his work, and these are inherited by his offspring. In the wake of the discovery of epigenetics, a field of study that looks at how behavioural and environmental factors can influence and change our gene expression, some have sought to reintroduce a modified form of Lamarckian inheritance, but that debate is a topic for a different time. Lamarck is, according to Mary Midgley, responsible for the idea that life is a vast escalator proceeding steadily upwards from lifeless matter through plants and animals to man, inevitably on to higher things. This anthropocentric view of evolution was taken up by many, including Herbert Spencer, that complexity and humanity are necessarily the end goal of an evolutionary process. And they can be. Humans are very adaptive, and there are huge advantages that our minds and bodies have over other animals. It's the necessary part that bothers me most about this idea. I distrust how similar it is to the idea that the world was created for us and us alone. But anyways, before we go any further, let's define what we mean by the terms evolution, natural selection, and survival of the fittest. For simplicity's sake, I will be using the Encyclopedia Britannica for each of these definitions, so feel free to skip ahead if you already know what I'm talking about and want to get to the meat of the video. Evolution is the theory in biology postulating that various types of plants, animals, and other living things on Earth have their origin in other pre-existent types, and that the distinguishable differences are due to modifications in successive generations. The theory of evolution is one of the fundamental keystones of modern biological theory. So, for example, over millions of years, the swim bladders of a species of fish may develop into lungs, allowing them to go onto land. Initially just a cross between bodies of water separated by land, but over time allowing them to take advantage of the land and its particular environmental conditions. Natural selection is the process that results in the adaptation of an organism to its environment by the means of selectively reproducing changes in its genotype or genetic constitution. It is a process via which those of a species who are best adapted to our current environment are able to survive, reproduce, and pass on their genes down the generations. Finally, survival of the fittest is a term made famous in the 5th edition of On the Origin of Species by British naturalist Charles Darwin, which suggested that organisms best adjusted to their environment are most successful in surviving and reproducing. Darwin borrowed the term from English sociologist and philosopher Herbert Spencer, who first used it in his 1964 book Principles of Biology. Now, as the Encyclopedia Britannica mentions, survival of the fitter is probably a more appropriate term, at least for Darwin's interpretation. Fitness is relative to particular environmental conditions or ecological niches. What is fit for one particular time and place may not be what is fit for another. We can almost see this in real time, as many well-adapted animals throughout the globe struggle to survive sudden changes in their environmental conditions thanks to climate change, whilst other species suddenly flourish under these new conditions, overgrowing and altering their local environment further. A common example is the expansion of harmful algae blooms in response to rising temperatures. These algae blooms can significantly alter their local ecosystems due to their overabundance, potentially leading to a loss of biodiversity. Another useful example is that of the red and grey squirrels in the UK. Red squirrels, prior to the introduction of grey squirrels from North America, were the fittest for their particular ecological niche. However, when the grey squirrel was introduced, they were swiftly outcompeted by a species better adapted to do so. They were larger and a bit more aggressive, driving the red squirrels further and further north until you can only find them in the furthest northern reaches of the island of Britain. The relativity of fitness is an important thing to keep in mind when thinking about and discussing evolutionary theory, especially when trying to apply it to human beings or even other animals.
There are a plethora of interconnected and multifaceted factors influencing evolution,
without the addition of some predetermined idea about what fitness means for human beings. And that's also without accounting for human behaviour, psychology, and society in general. After all, to quote Mary Midgley, social wholes, in fact, are almost always more than the sum of their parts, and can sometimes develop very remarkable independent characters and forces.
Science is a liar sometimes.
Oh boy.
Now, from the examples I've given you so far, and how Darwin seemed to talk about evolution via the process of natural selection, I think I've left a bit of an impression that nature is entirely violently competitive. that it is red of tooth and claw, to use a mandatory and overused Tennyson quote, that humans, by extension of coming from nature, too must be in a Hobbesian war of all against all. And this would do humanity and nature a great disservice. For one, nature, evolution, it has no intent behind it. It is a process that lacks any teleology, which is a philosophical term to describe a final cause, goal, or aim. The focus of a teleological explanation is in reference to its purpose. Now, often we cannot help but describe scientific phenomena in terms dripping with teleology. The introduction to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Biology article on teleological notions in biology summarizes this very clearly with the following passage. The manifest appearance of function and purpose in living systems is responsible for the prevalence of apparently teleological explanations of organismic structure and behavior in biology. Although the attribution of function and purpose to living systems is an ancient practice, teleological notions are largely considered ineliminable from modern biological sciences such as evolutionary biology, genetics, medicine, ethology, and psychiatry, because they play an important explanatory role. Still, it is important to remember that there is no driving force like a mind behind evolution, just as there is no will or mind behind the laws of thermodynamics. As the quote mentions, much of the teleological language that exists in biology originates prior to evolution being accepted as a dominant paradigm in use for describing the origins of life. If it often sounds like there is a creative force, with will and intent, that's why. It is but leftovers from previous discarded theories, usually involving gods or God, though not necessarily. A good example comes from Aristotelian physics, in which a rock falls to the ground because the nature within it is attracted to the center of the earth. The rock desires to be with those of like nature. Instead of the laws of motion and gravity, there is intent and desire.
Making Aristotle and everybody else on Earth look like a bitch.
On a slight but related tangent, this is not the only issue of language that evolutionary biology and the sciences in general face. It is in the nature of science to often be reductive and use simplified, technical language to describe complex situations, and often this works out just fine. Unfortunately, this can sometimes affect how the data is applied and understood. Sometimes as a consequence, situations can occur where, for example, a one-to-one relationship is described between individual genes and behavior. You see, a single gene does not code for a single behavior. To say this gene codes for aggression and this gene codes for cooperation is a fundamental error. The situation is far more complex. There are often numerous genes interacting with each other via the proteins they code and various regulatory mechanisms involved with their expression, and that is without accounting for past experience, leading to both psychological conditioning and the potential of epigenetic modification of the genes expressed, along with the influence of the present environmental stimuli. As you can see, it gets complicated. Mary Midgley discusses such a situation on page 46 of her book, Evolution as a Religion. There is a systematic distortion of language in frequent talk of genes as coding for behavior, as if a given gene produced a given unit of behavior, independent of all experience, as infallibly as it might produce brown eyes. That very shrewd ethologist, Patrick Bateson, in a recent interview, tells a significant story of how he took a colleague to task for using this language in an otherwise excellent article on the genetic analysis of behavior. I said, "You can't mean that genes bear any straightforward correspondence to behavior," and I began to give him a lecture on the system's character of development. He listened quietly and replied disarmingly, "You are right. The trouble is I can't think like that." The language used in scientific discourse is important. It was also one of my greatest failings personally when I was still involved in scientific research. I once had a professor who was conducting my annual review describe a particularly poorly worded sentence simply as yuck. Looking back, I cannot help but agree with their assessment. So when we go from using competitive as a descriptive term for a complicated and multifaceted process to, say, saying that nature is by definition selfish
or competitive,
problems can arise. Especially when you're using an outdated beanbag view of genetics to say that individual genes are competing with each other to replicate, which seems to me to ignore the scientific consensus on gene regulation and expression of the time it was written in, let alone the consensus of the modern day, of how heavily interconnected genes can be for the purpose of their regulation. Yes, that was a slight against Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. I'm not a big fan of the man or his works, probably because I have quite a few trans friends. It should be noted that Dawkins' stated intent was to be metaphorical in his selfish depiction of genes. In my opinion, the metaphorical aspect does get lost in the underlying ideology of the work, but at least the intent was there. Though I'm sure he would say my personal issues with the selfish gene are linked to a radical ideology, so Spider-Man meme all round, I guess. I should also mention that the gene-centered view of evolution is far from a settled matter and still hotly debated today. This was just my own overly simplistic and heavily biased take on the matter. Apologies for the long tangent, and back to the overly violent and competitive view of nature.
I respect you. That's why you fail.
Did Darwin himself not talk frequently about the struggle for existence? That sounds pretty violent to me. A clarification of this point was succinctly stated by paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and historian of science Stephen Jay Gould in his essay Kropotkin Was No Crackpot. This essay explores the views expounded by naturalist and anarchist philosopher Peter Kropotkin in his book Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, one of the earliest refutations of competitive social Darwinism. Though I guess you could see Kropotkin's work as social Darwinism with a positive, cooperative spin. Gould sought to present these ideas in the context of late 19th and early 20th century academic Russian engagement with the works of Darwin. In the essay, Gould states, Darwin's struggle for existence is an abstract metaphor, not an explicit statement about bloody battle. Reproductive success, the criterion of natural selection, works in many modes. Victory in battle may be one pathway, but cooperation, symbiosis, and mutual aid may also secure success in other times and contexts. Gould goes on to cite the following passage from The Origin of Species, 1859 edition, in reference to the struggle for existence. I use this term in a large and metaphorical sense, including dependence of one being on another, and including, which is more important, not only the life of an individual, but the success in leaving progeny. Two canine animals in a time of dearth may be truly said to struggle with each other, which shall get food and live. But a plant on the edge of a desert is said to struggle for life against the drought. As the mistletoe is disseminated by birds, its existence depends on birds, and may metaphorically be said to struggle with other fruit-bearing plants, in order to tempt birds to devour and thus disseminate its seeds rather than those from other plants. In these several senses, which pass into each other, I use for convenience sake the general term of struggle for existence. Darwin's views on evolution always came across to me as being nuanced and metaphorical, which Gould did an admirable job of highlighting throughout his career. But as a man of his particular time and place, Darwin was not immune to the prevailing winds of his academic context. To quote Gould once again, Darwin did present an encompassing metaphorical definition of struggle, but his actual examples certainly favoured bloody battle. Darwin based his theory of natural selection on a dismal view of Malthus that growth in a population must outstrip food supply and lead to overt battle for dwindling resources. Unsurprisingly for a man who lived over 150 years ago and wrote about a field of study subject to change and development, Darwin was occasionally wrong about things. For example, his hypothesis of pangenesis, in which the body continually emits small particles called gemmules, which aggregate in reproductive glands to pass on heritable information gained during life, which, if you remove the weirdness about gemmules, does have some similarities to epigenetics, in probably a closer fashion than the Lamarckian inheritance, since, according to Darwin, pangenesis worked in conjunction with natural selection. And epigenetic modifications are sometimes passed down generationally. For a classic example, see studies on the consequences of the Dutch famine in the 1940s. It is the nature of scientific research for mistakes to be made and to be subsequently corrected by further research. It is why science is often referred to as a self-correcting field. It is also why good faith critical engagement is so vital to scientific development. Scientific data may be falsified. Paradigm shifts may occur. This doesn't so much make scientific analysis wrong, but adaptive, and as I mentioned before, when carried out properly and critically engaged with, self-correcting. though I will admit that this is difficult, especially when accounting for ideological and especially financial interests. Before finishing this segment, I would like to bring up Kropotkin once again. He states in Mutual Aid, "If we ask nature, who are the fittest, those who are continually at war with each other, or those who support one another? We at once see that those animals which acquire habits of mutual aid are undoubtedly the fittest. They have more chances to survive, and they attain, in their respective classes, the highest development of intelligence and bodily organisation." Kropotkin believed that humans were more cooperative by nature, that habits of mutual aid are more evolutionarily fit than competition, and in some cases that is very likely true, but in other cases it's just as likely to be false. As much as my bleeding heart hates to admit it, I believe that there is just as much a capacity for cooperation, mutualism and altruism as there is for selfishness and violent competition. Though, once again, I could be wrong. Now, some will argue that all cooperation and altruism is just another form of selfishness. In his 1974 book, The Economy of Nature and the Evolution of Sex, biologist, philosopher, and bioeconomist, the name of that field alone gives me shudders, Michael T. Gislin argues, "Where it aids his own interests, every organism may reasonably be expected to aid his fellows. Where he has no alternative, he submits to the yoke of communal servitude. Yet given a full chance to act in his own interest, nothing but expediency will restrain him from brutalizing, from maiming, from murdering his brother, his mate, his parent or child. Scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed." Now, I'm not going to delve too deep into the selfishness narrative in this video, as I find the whole debate both fascinating and worrying enough to dedicate an entire video to it at some point in the future. I hope. I will, however, mention that this statement feels dripping with a hyper-individualistic and Hobbesian ideology, that we are all individual rational actors competing in a state of nature for our own self-interest. I don't know about you lot, but I certainly don't feel like an independent, rational actor most of the time. More like an irrational mess of competing thoughts and ideologies, but that's just me. It also feels reflective of the individualistic context of the time and place the society he lived in, the United States in the 1970s, universalized and applied without context to all times and places. To me, it is likely we are not naturally predisposed solely to competition or to cooperation, but to both. And that is without accounting for the numerous other factors that can play a role in how selfish or selfless we act as individuals or as a society. Basically, things are complicated. I don't think we can turn to nature or even science to determine things such as morality. This is often known as the is-ought problem, or the naturalistic fallacy, which are two separate but related things I'm conflating. Don't get me wrong, empirical and scientific evidence should inform ethics and morality. If it turns out one moral or ethical system has horrific consequences, we should know about that. It just can't be used to determine ethical or moral systems.
Welcome to ladders.
I think I should clarify a bit more about what I mean when I say evolution is not a ladder to greatness. Now, I'm not referring to Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould's theory of punctuated equilibrium, that most species will remain evolutionarily stable until a rapid speciation event occurs. I'm referring specifically to the idea that evolution is an inevitable progress upwards to greater and greater heights that I referred to earlier in this video. That humanity is the peak of this ladder, or the stepping stone to some kind of Superman. The idea is represented well by zoologist and eugenicist Ernest Haeckel's Pedigree of Man illustration, that you should all be seeing right now. Have I done my editing right? Or Nietzsche's idea of the Superman, or Übermensch. Though he probably would have hated that comparison, as far as I'm aware, Nietzsche was not a fan of a lot of Haeckel's views, especially the eugenics social Darwinist stuff. Still, I think the following quote from the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra says volumes. "I teach you the Übermensch. Man is something that is to be surpassed. What have you done to surpass man? All beings hitherto have created something beyond themselves, and you want to be the ebb of that great tide, and would rather go back to the beast than surpass man. What is ape to man? A laughing-stock, a thing of shame. And just the same shall man be to the Übermensch, a laughing-stock, a thing of shame. Ye have made your way from worm to man, and much within you is still worm. Once ye were apes, and even yet man is more of an ape than any of the apes. Even the wisest amongst you is only disharmony and a hybrid of plant and phantom. But do I bid you become phantoms or plants? Lo, I teach you the Übermensch. The Übermensch is the meaning of the earth. Let your will say, the Übermensch shall be the meaning of the earth. As much as I enjoy Nietzsche's often aphoristic, poetic turn of phrase and his willingness to interrogate even the most sacred of social norms, I cannot help but be concerned by the elitism inherent to much of his work, and this in particular. The disdain held for those unable to surpass themselves and take the steps towards becoming a Übermensch. It seems a cold and cruel form of progress to me, but maybe I'm just poorly interpreting Nietzsche. As I said earlier, there is nothing necessary or inevitable about humanity. We are contingent creatures that could very well have not have occurred, even with an almost complete replication of the conditions that generated us. This, however, does not mean we are beings that came about via pure chance either. I think the Ukrainian-American geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky, famed for helping shape the modern synthesis of Darwinian evolutionary theory with Mendelian inheritance in the 1940s, said it well when he states, "Evolution is neither necessary, in the sense of being predestined, nor is it a matter of chance or accident. It is governed by natural selection, in which the ingredients of chance and anti-chance are blended in a way which makes the dichotomy meaningless, and which renders evolution to be a creative process. The chance in mutation is blind, but neither is it pure nor absolutely free. Natural selection is an anti-chance agent. Its actions, however, do not amount to necessity. Its outcome is unpredictable in the long run." Both chance and determinism play a role in the process of natural selection. Chance in the case of what mutations may arise, and determinism in that the useful mutations will be passed along down the generations. This doesn't mean that less useful mutations won't occur or be passed down on generationally. Very often, apparently useless mutations may occur that aren't actively harmful or deleterious. In this case, there is no selective pressure for the mutations to be removed. They may even prove to be beneficial at some point in the future, when environmental conditions change. I believe that this is a contributing factor as to why natural selection seems to favour diversity. The sheer variety of forms of life expressed in nature could very well be related to the potential evolutionary benefits of diversification. In a slightly ironic and amusing, at least to me, side note, Dobzhansky believed in theistic evolution, the view that God acts and creates through the laws of nature, generally accepting the scientific consensus on things such as the age of the Earth, Big Bang, evolution, and standing in stark opposition to creationism. Despite his theistic beliefs, Dobzhansky often comes across as more secular and less ideological than many atheist authors like Nietzsche, though that may be related to Nietzsche's desire to create new myths for humanity to believe in. The idea that evolution is unpredictable in the long run is one of the many reasons why I find suggestions that evolution is necessarily guiding humanity upwards towards greater heights of intelligence or physical strength so silly. For one, what form of intelligence are you referring to? Individual humans can often show great intelligence in some matters and abject stupidity in others. Is it the particular type of intelligence you happen to express and be lauded for? Then, is it not rather egocentric to believe that all humans should and will become more like you? Either that or be discarded in the genetic dumpster? I think we begin to see the problem of this kind of thinking, what it could lead to. Diversity and variation is very often a strength. To neglect them, or actively attempt to inhibit them, is to inhibit the process of natural selection. The theory that is used to argue for a homogenized end goal of evolution in the first place. Unless you're a eugenicist, and then you go through a very disturbing artificial selection process. But anyway, to me, this seems blatantly contradictory. Natural selection leads to branching paths in the tree of life. It induces differentiation. If I was to commit a naturalistic fallacy of my own, and bring nature into the socio-political realm, it would probably be that natural selection and evolution favours pluralism. Though this statement being a fallacious one, it too could have all sorts of problems. if it was followed to its logical conclusion. Before we finish up, I want to leave you with one last quote from Mary Midgley. It may be morally necessary to treat our own destiny as the most important thing conceivable, if only because we cannot easily conceive anything greater. But this by no means licenses us to separate it from all others and to pursue it at their expense. Nor does it mean, as escalator fanciers sometimes kindly suggest, that our duty to those behind us is to help them become more like ourselves as quickly as possible. The moral consequences of a serious attitude to our own destiny are excellent, but those of a contemptuous attitude to other destinies are quite another matter. The two should not be linked at all. It is important that we take our own future seriously. It is just as important that we do the same for the futures of others. Viewing the future as a singular path forward with only contempt for the paths of others, well, you could argue that this is one of the reasons why we face a future and increasingly present climate crisis. So, what have we learned today? Well, I hope I've managed to successfully provide some clarification on the nature of natural selection and evolution, hopefully without too much of my own biases thrown in. I hope you're able to take away from this video an understanding that natural selection isn't always competitive, and that fitness is relative to specific conditions. That the process of evolution is often complicated by numerous factors. I hope I've also managed to convey the dangers of making assumptions about the future of our species. I think humanity still has the potential for a brighter and better future, but it's not inevitable. It may also take a form we can't fully understand in the present. There is no straight line from A to B, no ladder straight to the stars or to a superhuman future. A humbler approach may be what's best, one that acknowledges our interdependence on the world around us and the power of diversity in our species' continual survival and success. Thank you all for watching. I hope the video was informative, entertaining, and hopefully not too biased or ideological for your tastes. If it was, then just let me know down in the comments below. Thanks again to everyone who subscribed, watched, liked, commented, all that jazz. It's really much appreciated. Hope I'm able to make something interesting for you all. Take care.